James, thank you very much indeed for joining us for this Jerome Moross centenary celebration. I'd like to begin by just drawing attention to the extraordinary difference in character and style and ambience in each film score that Jerome Moross wrote. And even though we know that The Big Country was such a major step forward in his career in respect of, let us say, his fame, but nevertheless, all these other films that he wrote the music for, they are all very important, many of them not so well known today. And again, it's this individuality where the music is describing the characterization and the sentiment of the place and the situation. This brought out in Moross in the way that he was such a greatly creative and reactive composer, brought out in Moross such a diversity, it seems to me, of styles and characteristics. I mean, if you take the two films that were adjacent to each other, they're so different. The Proud Rebel and The Big Country, two enormously different film scores.
Well, exactly. I mean, and with Big Country, I mean, he probably created a whole way of scoring westerns for that period. I suppose him and Elmer Bernstein with Big Country, and then Elmer with Magnificent Seven. Those are the two iconic western film scores, and they say everything one could want to say about how you score a western movie.
Yes, and then when you come to The Proud Rebel, written around the same time, to my ears, I think to the ear, it sounds like such a different musical style. It may not be a different musical style, academically speaking, but the sound of it, the feeling of it, because of the different story, it seems to me is so very, very different. That to me is such an interesting and important quality about Jerome Moross as a composer.
Yeah, I think the good thing was, in a way, he only did about 20 feature film scores, because a lot of the time he was more interested. Maybe that's the wrong word, but his main concern was writing the musicals. He was very much into writing shows and ballets and that type of thing. But with his film scores, because he did relatively few, every film he approached sounded fresh. Whereas sometimes a composer could get on a treadmill, like in the 40s and 50s with Steiner, he'd be doing like 20, 30 scores a year. And it's sometimes difficult to separate one from another because of the pressure of work. Whereas Moross always sounded fresh, always sounded youthful and energetic, and also so easy in that sometimes you know where a film score is trying to fit in with certain scenes and they're trying to use certain musical tricks to make it work. Whereas Moross just wrote like a 3-minute cue, which have a beginning, a middle, and end, and seemed effortless in fitting to the action.
Yes, well, that emphasis on a cue that had 3 separate parts on it, a real form of its own, I think that's so much part of all Moross's composition that he felt dramatic expression had to have a very powerful, tight form to it, to bring across. It wasn't an academic point, it was a dramatic point, wasn't it, to bring across the drama. So, in a sense, these film scores are very symphonic, but for a dramatic, theatrical, filmic purpose.
Well, exactly. I mean, I suppose it's just pure musicality. He just knew exactly what would fit without it sounding like it was being sort of like these days they do everything to click track and so on. It just sounded like it was natural.
Now, The Proud Rebel, I think Jerome Moross was very fond of this film, although it had been cut about a lot, the score, by the time it was appearing in the cinemas. But I think he was very fond of the score, fond of the subject matter of the film. The Proud Rebel, well, it almost tells us something about Jerome Moross himself, I think. And I find this score very touching. I mean, it is a very moving piece, isn't it? It's the exact opposite of an epic. It's so different from The Big Country. And there is compassion, there is also strength in it. And it's a very powerful score. It's a very powerfully expressive score, don't you think?
It's very powerful, but also there's moments of great elegance, and a lot of it is very pastoral in nature. And yes, I suppose Big Country is out and out, not bombast, but it's really action music a lot of the way, whereas Proud Rebel gets more into the characters and the motivation behind the characters.
Then if we look at the Cardinal, now straight away from the very beginning, to me that conjures up the whole atmosphere of the place, the oppression, of the environment, and this very oppressive feeling and intense kind of darkness, really, and power to it. Again, a totally different sound world, a completely different musical expression. It's the same composer, it's Moross, but it's so different. It's absolutely expressing I've used the word twice, it's the only word I can think of, oppression and oppressiveness of the story and of the place. It may sound awfully far-fetched what I'm going to say, but almost in the same sort of mould as Puccini's Tosca, after all, Rome at a not too dissimilar time.
Yeah, and again, it's not. It's a quite a long film. I think it's 2.5 hours long, but the score is minimal in that. I think there's probably only about 30 or 40 minutes. But wherever the music appears, again, it adds something else to the characters. I mean, that's the main thing. Music in a movie should give you an extra dimension or an extra emotion, or tell you what the characters are thinking without drawing attention to itself too much. It's like Maurice Jarre said to me that if the audience is too aware of the music, then they're not as interested in the film as maybe they should be. Whereas Moross totally served what the film required in a great musical sense, but without sort of saying, look, here's a great music score, you listen to this, you don't need to listen to the dialogue. He served exactly what the directors or producers would want for the particular scenes.
Well, that's an important point you've brought up there, and it brings me really to your CDs, because these marvellous CDs that you've produced, they stand on their own, by which I mean, although this music, this diversity of music that he wrote for the films are, of course, tied into the stories and the situations, of course, of the films, but when we hear this music out of its context, it stands up on its own as very strong and powerful music, even if you don't know what the original story was and what the music was actually written for.
I think so. I think, because there's a lot of film music concerts these days where the main themes are played, but there's often some film music concerts where they play secondary music, which just doesn't work outside of the images. Whereas Moross had this happy knack of, as you say, writing music that worked perfectly with the scene, but also if you took it away from that, you'd think maybe, oh, is this a ballet or is this a symphony? It worked by itself as well.
Yes, and you see, for me it's very interesting because I don't know all the Jerome Moross films. Now, your CDs, these excellent liner notes you've written. So, for instance, Valley of Gwangi, that's not a film that I actually knew until I started work on this project. I knew of it, but I didn't know the actual film. Now, I read your excellent liner notes, and then, having read the liner notes, then when I listened to the music on the CD, the music is so expressive that having read the liner notes, I get a fairly vivid picture. I know it's not complete, of course it's not complete, but I get a fairly vivid picture of what this film is about because of the immediately expressive nature of Jerome Moross's music. I think that is a very special quality in him.
Yes, and I mean, the obvious reason why they cast Moross to write that score was because of the Big Country. They wanted a Western score. I believe, I might be wrong in this, but I believe Bernard Herrmann originally was going to compose the score because he'd done so much with the team who'd made those movies, like Jason and the Argonauts and Seven Voyages of Sinbad. And so Bernard Herrmann was the obvious choice, being their regular composer. But he said, no, I think you should have Jerome Moross do this because you need a Western action score in the style of Big Country. Even though it's sort of about prehistoric animals, it is, at the end of the day, a Western. And Moross just had this happy knack of writing music for the open air, for the wide expanses, for the plains and the mountains and the West.
I think, don't you, that Moross must have also been a very fine conductor. There's very little of him on recording conducting, but The Big Country, he did conduct that. Now, that's a very demanding score indeed, and there's a great rhythmic drive and colour and a command of all the rhythmic complexities. That's real talented conducting, to be able to cope with that so well and bring that off so very, very brilliantly.
Well, exactly, but also being able to conduct music that flowed, that just kept its momentum, and that fitted the 3 minutes 30 seconds or whatever the scene is with ease. And I think he probably wrote music that he knew he would enjoy conducting. And there's certain composers, film composers, who will write a cue and think, I'll make this really difficult for me to conduct, or I'll make this a real joy to conduct. So I just get a sense of joy in a lot of his music.
That's interesting that you say that, because in particular, relating to what you've said, there's an interview that I discovered with Jerome Moross. It's in the Other Minds archive. It's actually an interview about the music of George Antile, who was a friend of Moross, but Moross is talking during the interview quite a bit about himself as well. What comes through is a personality of great joy. Now, sensitivity, depth, seriousness, but charm and joy and wit, great wit, but joy. Everything that you've just said there. He was, I feel, he understood suffering, and he suffered himself. But it seems to me that the quality that most of all comes through Moross the man and Moross the music is a quality that's positive.
I think so, and also because he had this dual life of writing the occasional film score and then writing concert works, but more importantly, writing musicals. I think that a lot of the wit came from the music he wrote with John Latouche, the librettist. There was a lot of very witty songs that they composed together. So I think it crossed over from the musicals to the film scores.
Yes, now in The Golden Apple, which he collaborated with Latouche on, this again is so original and so diverse within the structure of this whole story and ambience there. And I think, with everything he wrote, whether they were the musicals or whether they were the ballets or whether they were the films, everything Moross did was very, very individualistic. We hear so much all the time. He was a great expresser, if you like, of Americana. Yes, he was, but in a very individualistic way. There's no formulaic writing here. He was a one-off, wasn't he? And I think he was altogether, both as a musician and as a man, he was his own man. He was not doing lip service to any preconceived ideas or any formulae that people may have wanted from him.
Exactly, and I think it's a little bit sad that some of his musicals aren't better known, because he was a precursor almost for Sondheim in that he developed a certain style which was very intelligent music. It wasn't Rodgers and Hammerstein big lush songs, but it was very witty and almost the type of thing that Sondheim came up with years later.
Well, absolutely. I feel that The Golden Apple predates, whether it's a coincidence or not, I just don't know, but it sounds to me that The Golden Apple really predates Candide, Bernstein's Candide. Well, Candide was written only a few years afterwards, but it does seem to me to have a kind of precursor feeling of what was going to happen then. And it's certainly a precursor of much later musicals, both on Broadway and also here in England on the West End.
I think so. I think it's a shame Moross didn't, live longer, because he was developing a new style of Broadway musical which bridged the gap between the more operetta style and the sort of modern American style of musical. And I think Moross sort of filled that void.
He has had an appalling lack of recognition for all sorts of reasons. That's one reason why we're making a very big splash, as much as we can, with this centenary programme. And his originality can be heard in so many different forms. If you take his extraordinary one-act opera, Sorry, Wrong Number. Now this is a work of tremendous tension, but brilliantly so because there's hardly any action in it. It's nearly all psychological. And the way that he creates this musical and dramatic feeling that you don't know what's going to happen next, this is masterly. Now, I think it's very, very wrong that this work isn't better known. We're going to play a little bit of it on our programme, but this should be better known. So much of his music should be much better known than it is.
Exactly, it is a shame because, and I know to a certain extent, because he used his movie work to finance the musical side, and so unfortunately we lost him too soon. So there weren't enough film scores written, and certainly not enough musicals. But what he has left us, I mean, film score wise, I mean, okay, The Big Country is so well known, but when you delve into the smaller works, I mean, Rachel is a particular favourite of mine. A lot of the music actually wasn't finally used in the Paul Newman directed movie, but what there was just so perfect for a film in the sort of mid to late 60s, at a time where people were more into films like Easy Rider with rock songs and so on. Moross was still writing gentle, pastoral Americana music that totally suited the subject.
I wonder whether you will possibly agree with me. I've put this question to many of our contributors. Many of them don't agree with me. One or two do sort of agree. But you see, I think although we hear so much Americana in Moross's music, I think the pathos that was such a very important part of his expression, not a self-indulgent pathos, but a very touching pathos, in the harmony, in the chromaticism, also in the orchestration, I feel that this is a result somewhere of his genetic Russian Jewish roots. It sounds European, that part of his expressiveness, to me. I don't know if you agree.
I think so. Also, a lot of it is very pentatonic and very folk-like. And so, again, that is instantly appealing. Whereas, in the same sort of period, you've got people like Alex North writing very dense, very complex, very difficult scores sometimes to listen to. Whereas Moross would still write difficult music, but it was, first and foremost, always very listenable and well-structured.
It's interesting, isn't it, that when he first went to Hollywood, they found him very avant-garde, which is why he did orchestrations before he was offered a film, so that even then, in the early 40s, they found that he was adventurous, unusual, different. And maybe this was part of, this expressiveness that was in him was so... it was so much more complex. Is that the right word? It certainly wasn't what people had been used to in films, even though he was to become such a famously successful film composer.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, he was just maybe more subtle, and just, I suppose, knew what would work for him. I mean, in those days, of course, in the 1950s, the composers were still totally trusted. So a composer would be assigned to a movie, I mean, often by the head of music of a particular film company. So Alfred Newman or Lionel Newman would assign a certain film to a certain composer and then leave them to write the music unfettered by having to do temp tracks and demos and so on, because then the composers were totally trusted. And in a way, the composer could still maintain their own individual voice while serving the needs of a film. But Moross was certainly a totally individual voice, and nobody else sounded like him.
Well, absolutely, yes. I mean, what you've said there really sums up the most important aspect of Jerome Moross's work, to me at any rate, as well as, of course, his expressive genius, but his individuality. And we hear it all through this remarkable range of films. Each one is so different. So, James, thank you very much indeed for giving us such a very, very informative interview.
Can I just mention a couple of scores we haven't?
Yes, of course, please do. Absolutely.
Touched on?
Yes,
Okay.
right now, carry on.
Yeah. So as I was saying, I mean, the interesting thing is how relatively few scores Moross did, but that's because of his dual life between New York and Los Angeles. But for me, my favourite of all his scores, and the ones that made the biggest impression, is The Warlord. Because that, again, Moross is still very much his own man, but his music to have to adapt to medieval setting of Europe and knights and druids and the mystery of the sort of the period is amazing that he could adapt his own personal style to fit something so completely different from The Big Country, which was just composed a few years earlier. But I think The Warlord is a masterpiece.
Oh, I am so pleased you brought that up. I forgot to mention it and should have done. And in particular, of course, it's very important what you've just said. This shows us, doesn't it, the cultural awareness that Moross had, this broad, diverse understanding of different cultures, the feeling of those cultures and the way that he could express them. And this is partly linked, I think, to the way that he read so widely. We hear this in the interviews that we have with him on this programme. Wonderfully well-read and deeply read person. So I think part of this element of being able to create, particularly in this marvellous film, The Warlord, I agree with you, a really marvellous score. I think part of the success at creating that medieval atmosphere there was, it wasn't just an academic exercise. He had felt and understood what that world was like through his reading, and I absolutely am with you. It's a most extraordinarily evocative piece, and so different from The Big Country, really different.
Well, that's a particular favourite. I mean, obviously, I think, again, the main reason Moross isn't is really only known for A Big Country is because he wrote music for some pretty dismal films, but again, the music stands up. So, his very first score, Close Up, which was like a thriller set in New York, was a really low budget, but he still could have a full-size orchestra to beef up the action. So his first few scores, Close Up, Captive City, and Shark Fighters, are incredible scores. It's just a shame that the movies aren't particularly good.
I wonder whether you would possibly feel the same about Forget Me Not. Now, that's got a rather sad history to it, hasn't it? Although actually, I think I'm right in saying that the part of the music found its way later on into that lovely quintet that he wrote, piano quintet that he wrote. But it's almost as though maybe with Forget Me Not, had the film really been a successful film, it would have fulfilled, to me, the potential that Jerome Moross saw in it when he wrote the music. It's almost as though he was prophesying or viewing in the future the way that maybe it should go and it didn't go, as though he was ahead of the story almost, if you see what I mean.
Well, yes, I mean, to be honest, I haven't seen that, but there are certain scores where you don't know maybe what happened between the scoring and the final edit. I mean, for instance, Adventures of Huckleberry Finn was going to be an out-and-out musical with lots of songs. And then they felt maybe the songs were getting in the way, so that became, a straight drama, but still with a fabulous score. And as I say, with Valley of Gwangi, the music was composed in a certain way, but when the final edit came, they did re-edit the music and put it in all sorts of different places from where Moross originally wanted it. It still works, but I can hear where there are music edits which really don't work, and it would be so much better to keep the cues as they had been composed.
Yes, one of the joys of your CD of The Big Country is that we hear music that was composed for the film but wasn't used in the film. I can remember so well when I first saw The Big Country. It's such a long time ago now, but I remember it very, very well. I can see that cinema back in my home town, well, home suburb, I should say, as it was then, of southwest London, called Sheen. I can see that all that time ago. What, 55 years ago now, is it? I think something like that. But yes, 1958 it would be. And I can see that film. I can see, let us say, that first viewing of the film. I remember every bit about it so well. Now, I remember particularly one moment near the end, a very poignant moment after Rufus has killed his son, Buck Hannessy. Now, I remember so well when I saw that film that most of that took place without music. And, of course, it does. And if we hear the music that was going to be used, which you've got on your CD, that Jerome Moross had actually composed, well, I think it would have been better. I think it would have been really much more effective to have had that wonderful music that Moross composes for that scene. Some of the music, a small portion of the music is in the film, but most of it's left out.
Well, exactly. I'll tell you a little story about that particular cue. On the recording I did with the Philharmonia Orchestra, there's a totally misplaced timpani figure, which the timpanist just miscounted, came in the wrong place, but it worked so well we kept it in.
An excellent way, I think, to finish this conversation. James Fitzpatrick, thank you very, very much indeed for giving us your very informed expertise on Jerome Moross's film music for the Jerome Moross Centenary. Most grateful to you.